Norman Rockwell was born in 1894 and was an American illustrator who is most well known for his covers in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a weekly newspaper and one of the oldest today. Rockwell's works included characters, a lot of the time these were children, in comical and cute scenes. His work pictured the perfect American life in the 20th century. His work was also described to be as American as apple pie, which I think is very fitting. Rockwell was an oil painter, as all of his paintings were in oil. That was like his medium. And before he produced the final oil paintings, he would first start off with sketches like this one. And what I find really interesting about his sketches is the use of line and the use of mark making for the shadings, which I found really interesting. So I tried to recreate that. On the right is how I would normally sketch. And on the left is I try to incorporate Rockwell's mark making into my own sketching for the shading, because I thought it was really interesting. I over exaggerated some of the lines a bit, but it's because I really enjoyed that technique after trying it. And somebody who used a similar technique was J.C. Leyendecker, who was one of Rockwell's self-proclaimed idols. He was also his mentor, and he also worked at the Saturday Evening Post with Rockwell. You can see a lot of similarities in their work, down to how both their media was in oil and how they both like to paint children. But I would say Leyendecker's work, his characters were a bit more on the caricature side, but you can still see a lot of the similarities in their work. Rockwell was majorly inspired by current events, and you can see that throughout his work. But this is the Full Freedom series in 1943, which was his response to Franklin Roosevelt's promise of peace after the war. And these pieces were used a lot in American propaganda, as was Rosie the Riveter in 1943, which was an iconic piece of propaganda, and Rosie the Riveter became a household name and an icon for women in the Second World War. Interestingly, although Rockwell produced so much propaganda, he actually opposed war. When later on in his life he heavily opposed the Vietnam War, and I think he painted so much propaganda because it had the promise of peace. And as you can see from his early works, peace and the perfect life was something that I think he always wanted, and I feel like that's why he made so much propaganda, because he thought there was a promise of peace at the end. Rockwell's work was heavily critiqued, and was critiqued as being bland, kitsch, boring, and I feel like this was because there was a lot of other movements at the time, movements that weren't so conventional and traditional, such as Cubism, Surrealism, and abstract expressionism, which Rockwell actually pays homage to in one of his paintings, The Connoisseur, in 1961, where Rockwell himself produced a piece of abstract art resembling Jackson Pollock's work. Rockwell did admire this type of art, and this painting sums it up perfectly, as it's somebody admiring the work just as Rockwell did. Jackson Pollock was a leading artist in abstract expressionism at the time, and I think you can really see where Rockwell got his inspiration from for the last painting. In the early 1960s, Rockwell left the Saturday Evening Post, and a lot of people would say this was the start of his political awakening. And in 1963, Rockwell painted The Problem We All Live With, which illustrates what happened to Ruby Bridges when she tried to attend an all-white school that had been newly mixed. She was the victim of a racial attack. This became one of the most iconic paintings in the civil rights movement, and my personal favourite, because although this child was a victim, Rockwell does not paint her as that. He paints her as a little girl clutching her school supplies, but still confident and still wanting to go to school. This must have been a subject Rockwell was passionate about, as in 1967 he painted New Kids in the Neighbourhood, another painting that highlighted racial tension, but through the innocence and curiosity of children. Although Rockwell's works got critiqued for being too boring, too conventional, too traditional, I feel like his works are quite dystopian, because to me they show a perfect world, especially his earlier works, that could never happen, and I think he knew this too. So for my piece, I wanted to paint in oil just as he did, a girl and a boy holding hands over the phone, to represent how relationships were affected during the pandemic, which was a very dark time, but in a comical and cute way, just how I think Rockwell would have. I'm also going to try and use Rockwell's tracing method, where he would draw in charcoal, a detailed image, and then put it onto his canvas to paint over. And these are all techniques I'm quite new to, but I hope to achieve